The story of crucifixion is one of the darkest chapters in the history of human punishment. Long before the cross became the most recognized symbol in the world, it was a brutal device of torture and death, a method designed not only to end a life, but to prolong suffering, to humiliate, and to serve as a warning to all who looked upon it. To stand before a crucifixion in the ancient world was to witness slow destruction, a body suspended between earth and sky, stripped of dignity, reduced to pain, and exposed to the mocking of crowds and the indifference of soldiers. It was a punishment so severe that Roman citizens were legally exempt from it, reserved only for slaves, rebels, and the lowest of criminals. The cruelty of the cross is inseparable from the fear it inspired, a fear powerful enough to silence entire populations. Crucifixion did not begin with the Romans. Its roots reach back into older empires, where the display of the condemned was a spectacle of dominance. The Assyrians and Persians practiced forms of impalement and suspension, leaving enemies exposed to the elements as a warning. The Carthaginians, fierce rivals of Rome, also made use of it. When Alexander the Great conquered territories, he was said to have crucified thousands as punishment for resistance. What Rome inherited, however, it perfected. The Romans systematized crucifixion into a machinery of state power. It was not only an execution, it was theater, a statement that rebellion against the empire would end in slow, public ruin. The process itself began long before the cross was raised. The accused endured flogging with whips weighted with bone and metal, tearing flesh until the body was weakened, blood loss significant, and muscles exposed. When the procession moved from the place of judgment to the place of execution, the condemned was forced to carry the heavy wooden beam, the patibulum, across the shoulders. The vertical stake was already fixed at the site. The beam could weigh up to 40 kilograms, crushing against torn skin, splinters digging into flesh. The journey made harder by exhaustion and loss of blood. Crowds often gathered, some to jeer, some to watch in grim fascination. Soldiers marched alongside to prevent escape and to enforce the humiliation. The condemned man was both spectacle and warning, paraded through the streets as living proof of the empire's dominance. At the site, the victim was stripped naked, removing the last vestige of dignity. Then came the fastening to the cross. Some were tied with ropes, but the most infamous and agonizing method involved nails driven through the wrists or forearms, not the palms, as is often depicted, because only bone and ligament there could support the body's weight. The pain was searing, the nerves shredded, the shock immediate, but death was rarely quick. The crucified did not bleed out rapidly. Instead, they hung, the weight of their own body pulling down on lungs and diaphragm, making every breath a desperate effort. To inhale meant pushing against pierced feet or pulling with nailed arms, each motion sending fresh waves of agony. Hours passed, sometimes days. Hours passed, sometimes days as the body weakened. Dehydration, exposure to sun or cold, insect bites, muscle cramps, and sheer exhaustion compounded the suffering. The victim's breathing grew shallow, suffocation imminent, yet death was deliberately drawn out. When authorities wished to hasten the end, soldiers broke the legs with a heavy club, preventing the victim from pushing up to breathe, bringing asphyxiation within minutes. But often, no such mercy was granted. The condemned were left until life ebbed away, the corpse eventually removed only when scavengers, weather, or Roman orders allowed. Crucifixion was more than execution. It was psychological warfare. For slaves, rebels, or conquered peoples, to see bodies displayed in this way was to be reminded of the futility of defiance. In the aftermath of the slave revolt led by Spartacus, 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, a line of broken bodies stretching for miles, each one a silent proclamation of Roman power. Among all crucifixions, one stands apart in memory, that of Jesus of Nazareth. His execution in Judea was in many ways typical of Roman practice, yet it gained a significance that would echo across centuries. Arrested, flogged, Paraded through the streets of Jerusalem, he carried his cross toward Golgotha. Accounts describe the soldiers mocking him, a crown of thorns pressed into his head, the crowd divided between mourning and ridicule. The nails fixed him to the wood, his body sagging, his breathing labored. He spoke words remembered in gospel before finally succumbing. From a Roman standpoint, it was another execution among many. But for his followers, it became the turning point of history. From a medical perspective, the suffering he endured aligns with what we know of crucifixion. Severe blood loss from scourging, shock from trauma, nerve pain from nails, and progressive suffocation from suspension. The heart strained, the lungs collapsed under pressure, the body alternately racked by spasms and weakness. Death on the cross was the slow crushing of life by pain and exhaustion, cruelty distilled into its purest form. Though Jesus' crucifixion became the most famous, countless others died the same way. Insurrectionists, thieves, enemies of Rome, all displayed as warnings. Yet over time, the practice grew so notorious that even Roman voices called it barbaric. By the 4th century, with Constantine's conversion to Christianity, crucifixion was abolished. The empire that had used the cross to enforce obedience now outlawed it, and in a strange reversal, the cross itself was transformed from an emblem of terror into a symbol of hope, faith, and redemption. But the cruelty cannot be erased. Behind the polished gold crosses that hang in churches lies a reality of splintered wood, stained with blood, of bodies trembling and broken under the sun, of cries swallowed by the indifference of executioners. To remember the cross is to remember both sides of its legacy, the horror of human cruelty and the resilience of meaning drawn from suffering. The crucifixion endures not only in religion, but as a reminder of how power has been enforced through fear and how symbols of death can be reshaped into signs of life. The roots of crucifixion stretch back to a time before Rome ruled the Mediterranean. The Assyrians, infamous for their cruelty, were among the earliest to suspend their enemies in public view. Captives were impaled, their bodies lifted for all to see, a grim reminder of the empire's reach. The Persians followed, with their own variations of execution by suspension, often leaving victims hanging until birds and wild animals picked at their remains. Carthage, the great naval power of North Africa, also adopted crucifixion. When generals failed or when enemies defied their authority, the cross or stake awaited them. Alexander the Great, celebrated for his conquests, crucified 2,000 survivors after the siege of Tyre as a demonstration of uncompromising control. These instances were not merely punishments. They were public performances designed to instill terror, to project an image of absolute power that stretched beyond the battlefield into the psyche of conquered populations. By the time crucifixion entered Roman practice, it was already associated with shame, dishonor, and fear. Rome, however, elevated it into a calculated institution. To the Romans, execution was not only about ending life, but about reinforcing authority. Crucifixion became their most potent weapon against slaves and rebels, those considered beneath the dignity of a citizen. Roman citizens were almost never crucified, and when they were, such as in cases of treason, the punishment was regarded as extraordinary. The very exclusivity of crucifixion made it a mark of ultimate disgrace. To be crucified was to be treated as less than human, as property destroyed in public, as an example made for all others who might dare resist. The location of a crucifixion was part of its design. The condemned were taken to places of high visibility, often on hills near major roads, so that travelers and townsfolk alike would be confronted by the sight. The Romans understood psychology well. Pain inflicted in private might punish the individual, but pain displayed in public controlled the masses. Bodies hanging in plain view reminded everyone of the consequences of rebellion. The cross was Rome's billboard of terror, a silent message that no one escaped the grasp of imperial justice. The process leading to crucifixion was calculated to maximize suffering. The condemned were scourged with whips embedded with metal and bone, a punishment severe enough to kill some outright. Muscles were torn, blood vessels ruptured, nerves exposed. The condemned often collapsed under the blows, their backs left in ribbons of torn flesh. The heavy crossbeam was laid across torn shoulders, and the victim staggered forward while crowds gathered to watch. Each stumble, each collapse, was met with ridicule from the soldiers and laughter from onlookers. The condemned man's suffering was entertainment and instruction. He was no longer an individual but a symbol of Rome's power. Once at the site, the cruelty intensified. The stripping of clothing was an act of humiliation as well as preparation. Nakedness in public was dishonor, reducing the condemned to a state of utter vulnerability. Then came the nailing or binding. If ropes were used, death came more slowly, sometimes over several days, as the victim's body sagged until breathing became impossible. If nails were used, the agony was immediate and sharp. Driven through wrists or forearms, the nails severed nerves, sending lightning bolts of pain through the arms and chest. Nails hammered into feet or ankles fixed the lower body in place, forcing the victim to push against them in order to breathe. Each breath became an act of torment, each exhale a surrender to pain. Death on a cross was not a matter of minutes, but of endurance. The body weakened under blood loss, dehydration, exposure to the sun, and the unrelenting pull of gravity. Breathing grew shallow as the diaphragm failed. Spasms racked the muscles, insects landed on open wounds, and the condemned slipped into cycles of unconsciousness and agony. Death could come from suffocation, cardiac arrest, or multiple organ failure. To hasten the end, executioners sometimes shattered the legs, removing the victim's ability to lift himself to breathe. But this was not always done, for the spectacle of a prolonged death served the empire's purpose better than a quick release. To witness crucifixion was to confront the extremities of human suffering. Cicero, himself a man of rhetoric, called it the supreme penalty, and declared it so vile that it should never be mentioned among Roman citizens. Yet for slaves, rebels, and conquered peoples, it was an ever-present threat. After the rebellion of Spartacus, 6,000 of his captured followers were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road in a grotesque gallery of pain. For miles, travelers passed the site of rotting corpses, each one a warning not to challenge Rome. The cruelty was deliberate. Rome did not hide its violence, it displayed it. The crucifixion of Jesus occurred within this brutal framework. Though unique in its spiritual legacy, in practice it followed the Roman script. Arrested under charges of rebellion against Roman order, he was flogged, mocked, and paraded through Jerusalem carrying the beam of his cross. Soldiers and crowds followed as he stumbled toward Golgotha. Accounts tell of a crown of thorns pressed into his scalp, blood mingling with sweat, jeers rising from the crowd. At the hilltop, he was stripped and nailed to wood, raised high for all to see. His suffering mirrored that of countless others, his body sagging, his breaths labored, his life draining slowly as the sun moved across the sky. Yet from this death, meaning was born that transcended Rome's intent. From a clinical perspective, his crucifixion demonstrates the mechanics of the cross. The scourging inflicted massive trauma, weakening him before the nails pierced flesh and bone. The position of his body forced every breath into a contest between pain and necessity. Shock, dehydration, and exhaustion combined until the heart failed. The cry recorded in the Gospels captures the agony of body and spirit in those final moments. Rome believed it had silenced another rebel. Instead, it planted the seed of a faith that would one day redefine the cross itself. The emperor who embraced Christianity banned the very instrument of his savior's death, calling it too barbaric even for enemies of the state. With that decree, crucifixion faded from practice, but its image did not. The cross, once a sign of shame, became the central symbol of Christianity, transformed from a tool of oppression into an emblem of salvation. What was once a gallows became a banner of faith, adorning altars, crowns, and churches across the world. Yet beneath the gold and polished stone lies the memory of its cruelty. To gaze upon the cross is to see both victory and violence, both hope and horror. It reminds us of the extremes to which humans have gone to enforce power, and of the strange paradox that from such cruelty countless people have drawn comfort and meaning. The cross endures because it embodies both the depths of suffering and the possibility of transformation. It warns us of what humanity is capable of in its darkest moments, and it challenges us to reflect on how symbols of death can be remade into symbols of life. The cruelty of crucifixion lay not only in its slowness but in the way it turned the human body against itself. From the moment the condemned was raised on the cross, survival became a battle with gravity. The weight of the body dragged down on the arms, stretching muscles and joints beyond endurance. Shoulders often dislocated, leaving the victim suspended on ligaments and tendons that screamed with every movement. Breathing required constant effort as the ribcage was pulled upward in a fixed inhalation. To exhale, the condemned had to push against nailed feet or pull against pierced wrists, scraping torn flesh against splintered wood. Each breath was purchased with pain, each exhale a reminder of inescapable torment. The longer the body endured, the weaker it grew, until the struggle for breath could no longer be sustained. Blood loss from scourging weakened circulation. Shock from trauma sent the body into spirals of collapse. Asphyxiation loomed constantly as muscles failed. Heart failure, brought on by extreme stress and exhaustion, often sealed the end. Some scholars suggest that fluids built up in the lungs, drowning the victim internally. Others point to cardiac rupture from prolonged strain. Whatever the precise mechanism, the reality was unrelenting agony stretched over hours or days, a cruelty that exceeded the limits of imagination. Ancient witnesses described crucifixion with horror. The historian Josephus, a Jew who lived under Roman rule, called it the most miserable of deaths. He recorded mass crucifixions during the siege of Jerusalem, when so many were executed that crosses lined the horizon, each bearing a body in grotesque silence. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote of victims convulsing, gasping, and long begging for death that did not come. He spoke of the condemned as broken yet conscious, enduring every moment of their slow destruction. Cicero argued that the very word cross should be absent from the speech of a Roman citizen, so shameful and terrifying was the thought of such a fate. The spectacle was intense. Crucifixion was a public theater of dominance, a ritual of fear carefully staged to suppress resistance. Each onlooker was meant to absorb the message. Rome was merciless, and rebellion would end in disgrace. Families of the condemned were forced to see loved ones displayed, stripped of honor, turned into warnings. Children passing by the roads lined with crosses learned early the price of defiance. The cruelty was not only physical, it was psychological, embedding terror into the cultural memory of entire communities. This psychological terror was heightened by the stripping away of identity. Crucifixion was not just about killing, but about erasing dignity. Victims were displayed naked, exposed to ridicule, their bodies contorted in agony, their cries mingling with the mockery of crowds. The condemned became objects, no longer human in the eyes of the empire, reduced to instruments of propaganda. The slow pace of death made the lesson last longer. As long as the victim lived, the demonstration continued, a living billboard of Rome's authority. The crucifixion of Jesus, remembered as singular, was in fact one of many such executions. What set it apart was not the method, but the meaning attached to it. To his followers, his death revealed injustice, sacrifice, and ultimately, hope. Yet in that moment, the experience was the same as others who suffered Rome's cruelty. His body sagged against the pull of gravity. His breathing grew shallow. His words were forced through pain. His life ebbed away under the gaze of soldiers and spectators. That his crucifixion became the seed of a faith that transformed the world is a paradox against the backdrop of such cruelty. The empire meant to erase him. Instead, it created a symbol that outlasted the empire itself. As Christianity spread, the cross took on a new identity. No longer a mark of shame, it became a sign of triumph. Artists depicted it in mosaics and paintings. Saints wore it as a badge, and emperors raised it as a banner. Yet this transformation risks concealing its original brutality. The polished crosses that gleam in cathedrals are far removed from the rough beams stained with blood on execution hills. The sanitized symbol does not show the flies that swarmed over open wounds, the labored breaths, the whispered pleas for water, the silence that followed when death finally arrived. To remember the cross honestly is to remember both, the cruelty that made it feared and the faith that remade it. Even after crucifixion was abolished by Constantine in the 4th century, echoes of its cruelty lingered. Later methods of execution, from the gallows to the stake, carried the same principles. Public humiliation, prolonged suffering, and visible deterrence. Medieval Europe, though Christian, often inflicted punishments that mirrored crucifixion in their spectacle of pain. Bodies were displayed, executions staged as theater, reminders that power was maintained not only through laws, but through fear. The cruelty of the cross had left its imprint on human imagination, shaping the way societies thought about punishment and control. The paradox remains striking. An instrument of torture has become the most recognized symbol of compassion, forgiveness, and redemption. The transformation is radical, but it does not erase the cruelty from which it arose. If anything, it deepens the meaning. The hope associated with the cross is inseparable from the suffering it represents. The symbol cannot be understood without the agony of those who hung upon it. The cruelty of the cross is not only historical but human, a reflection of our capacity to inflict suffering and our need to find meaning within it. To reflect on crucifixion today is to confront uncomfortable truths about power, violence, and memory. The Roman cross reminds us how far authorities will go to maintain control, how suffering can be turned into spectacle, and how easily dignity can be stripped away in the name of order. It also reminds us of the resilience of human meaning-making, how communities can take a symbol of terror and remake it into one of hope. But the cruelty must not be forgotten. Every gold cross worn as jewelry, every stone cross raised on a church, carries within it the memory of wood and iron, of flesh and blood, of long hours of agony beneath an indifferent sky. It is the story of how humans wield power through cruelty, how pain is used as persuasion, how fear becomes a tool of control. It is the story of how societies remember and reinterpret suffering, of how symbols change even as the history beneath them remains. To understand the cruelty of the cross is to understand the darkest capacities of our species, and to recognize the strange possibility that even from such cruelty, new life and meaning can emerge. The crucifixion endures because it is both horror and hope, both shame and salvation. It is a reminder that the human story is written not only in triumphs, but in torments, not only in glory, but in suffering. To look at the cross honestly is to see both, the cruelty that ended countless lives in agony, and the resilience that transformed that cruelty into a message that continues to echo across centuries. The cruelty of the cross cannot be denied, and perhaps it should not be. For in remembering it, we remember what power unchecked can do, and what meaning can arise when cruelty is not the final word.